Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Legal Innovation's Reinvent Legal Business webinar and podcast series. I'm Terri Mottershead, the Executive Director of the Centre for Legal Innovation, and I'll be your facilitator for the session today. Today, we're looking at the financial management side of your legal business and focusing on assessing your financial situation right now. We're going to spend the next hour with Warrick McLean, CEO of Coleman Greig Lawyers. Hello, Warrick, just waving to you.
Hey, Terri, how are you?
And we're going to be talking about what you need to be identifying, analysing and thinking about as you take stock of where your legal business is financially right now. Tomorrow, as most of you know, we'll be back at this time with Warrick again to take this to the next stage. We'll be chatting about planning for the future or where you might find your legal business in the next few months, 12 months or thereafter, and also how you'll go about running the scenarios and financial planning to get you there. But in order to be able to move to the planning phase, we definitely need to focus on the sorts of things we'll be addressing today. We'll be running both sessions today and tomorrow as a Q&A style. I'll ask a bunch of questions of Warrick, and we want you to submit your own questions too. So if you look to the bottom of your screen now, you'll see a little thing that says Q&A. Please feel free to type in your questions as they come to you. We'll make sure that we get them all answered before we end the session today. A couple of quick housekeeping matters. Please switch off your webcams and microphones for the duration of the webinar. And a reminder, please, that we are recording this webinar and we'll be making it available in a podcast version too, just to increase that access and dissemination of what I know will be fabulous information. Again, welcome everyone and welcome Warrick.
Thanks, Terri. Thanks for having us.
So I thought we'd kick off the discussion today by asking kind of the first overarching question really in this session, and that is, why is it important to undertake a mini financial audit right now, and what is that likely to entail? And I know there's a lot in that to unpack. So let me just first ask a couple of, again, quite broad questions. And that is, how important is it to understand your client profile before you kind of launch into this? And then I think if we can get a little bit into the difference between a focus on cash versus profitability. So the client bit first, Warrick, please.
Terri, thank you. And I suppose just in terms of intro from my end, for those of you who don't know me, I suppose today is really going to be a practical analysis of what people should be doing. And again, I think, Terri, as you quite rightly highlighted, we're going into some pretty strange and uncharted territory, both health-wise and obviously economically. So again, getting on top of your practice and understanding where you sit financially at this point in time is super, super important. And again, I think it's at first blush, having a look at that client base and understanding your practice areas. And again, I'm conscious that this podcast is going out to a wide variety of firms in size and style, but ensuring that you've got a reasonable idea of where your revenues lie, and I suppose doing some crystal ball gazing in terms of understanding how those revenues may be impacted, both in the short and medium term. Again, Terri, if you've got a practice that's heavily geared towards property, again, that's a particular area, particularly here in Australia, where the federal government have announced in the last couple of weeks that, basically no in-person auctions, no formal traditional open houses. So we expect, obviously, in the time of economic downturn, that property may take a hit. So again, you've got to understand what that might look like. And again, tomorrow we'll do some more analysis around forecasting, etc. But again, on the flip side, you might have a particular practice and some real strengths in terms of practice areas where you may actually see a bit of an uptick. I know in our practice at the moment, our estate planning team has never been busier, with people being at home and wanting to get their affairs in order. So again, I think it's really important that practitioners have a clear idea in terms of what their practice mix looks like, again, and understand potentially how their clients might be impacted. I think the other thing to have a think about in terms of, for those with more of a commercial bent in terms of practice, understand what industries your clients are in and how those industries are going to be impacted. Obviously, anyone sort of in retail, franchising, hospitality, anything like that, obviously they've been significantly impacted. And obviously, if you've got a client base that's reflective of those industries, there will be some challenges ahead. Again, on the positive side, if you've got a good mix of clients in the transport and logistics space, everybody's going gangbusters at the moment in terms of hiring and buying online. So again, there's going to be winners and losers in terms of the next 3 to 6 months, particularly.
I guess there's an opportunity within doing or going through this process of your mini financial audit of really getting closer to your clients in many respects, in asking the sort of questions that you were speaking about. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of ways that you can reach out to your clients. Obviously, there's a lot of clutter out there in terms of content at the moment. So again, depending on the style of practice that you've got, I think it's really important that you clearly define who those key clients are and get on the front foot and communicate with them. Now, whether that might be something as a simple text, if you haven't heard from them, or literally picking up the phone and having a conversation, I can guarantee you that every client that you've got in your portfolio will have a question about what's going on currently. And if they haven't reached out to you yet, that's probably because they're busy doing their own thing. But again, I'm sure they would be very appreciative if you actually picked up the phone or messaged them accordingly. Most firms that have got an employment law bent would probably be getting a lot of inquiry from clients wanting to understand where all that sits. I know particularly the federal government and the state governments are still working through the formalities in terms of the code of conduct, in terms of leases, and particularly those commercial tenancies that are in place. And again, that information, I'm assuming, will be happening sort of pre-Easter in terms of formalities. So again, I think there's, over the next 3 to 4 weeks particularly, there's still going to be a lot getting bedded down. So it's really important to stay close to your clients and understand where their pain points are and how you can assist them.
Rory, let me pick up what you were talking about there about practice areas and assuming that you've got more than one and that not all of them are necessarily going to be operating at the same speed, or there may be offshoots of that, I guess, that you could be thinking about in terms of alternative income streams or perhaps expanding or contracting. When you're looking at that, how are you thinking about how you allocate your resources at the moment? So, is there a thought about what practice areas do we continue to support? What ones do we not? How do we allocate our resources? Should it be where the income is coming in? How are you managing all of that? Because I know you're a multi-practice area firm. How are you thinking about that and managing that in terms of your assessment of your financial position?
Yeah, great question, Terri. And again, I think it's really important. It's really about understanding, particularly for those people that are listening in on this that have got staff and a number of staff to manage or a reasonable headcount. Again, I think for us, we're trying to minimise the impact that this will have on staff. So whether that ultimately means pulling people across into different teams that potentially may not have traditionally worked in one particular area of the law, but their skills could be quite easily applied to that particular area. And again, also having a look in terms of analysis of your staffing mix casuals, etc., seeing where potentially you could make some savings, but then obviously reallocate resources. And again, we're being quite philosophical with that, in terms of, at this point in time, we're taking the approach that this pain that we will go through will be reasonably short term. But again, you don't necessarily need to be Einstein or have an accounting degree to understand that for some industries and some work types, the dip will be significant and take a while to come out. So again, it's whether you can maintain those resources in terms of people resources. But again, as I said, there may be some areas of law that actually are impacted in a positive way, and how you can assist. So for argument's sake, our employment law team is just getting hammered at the moment, and there's some litigation that's been ongoing. So obviously, in the short term, pulling the guys across from commercial lit to help with some of that employment law lit. Again, interestingly, family law is quite busy, and is in the lead up to Easter, working through parenting arrangements and access and all that goes with that. We're expecting that there'll be some interesting client calls and queries in relation to all that, and then post April, when everybody's been locked down and living with each other for 6 weeks, it'll be a bit like Christmas time, unfortunately, all over again, where people quickly realise that actually this relationship is not for me. So again, it's really about understanding how you have a look at your areas and seeing whether you can pull people into particular different areas. And that doesn't necessarily just mean solicitors as well. It could certainly mean support staff and getting creative with how they're used and allocated accordingly.
Thanks for that. And I wanted to turn now to cash flow, because obviously it's something that I'm sure is very much at the forefront of your mind and everyone who's looking at finances right now. But just to return briefly to that earlier question, is the difference between cash and profitability, and then I want to jump into some questions about cash flow itself. So difference between the two that people should be mindful of?
Look, Terri, those people who know me well would probably know, here he goes again on cash flow. Look, cash is king, and cash is even a bigger king in this time in terms of economically. Profitability is certainly an important factor in terms of analysis of overall financial performance. But you might have the most profitable firm in the land, but if you haven't got the cash in the bank to recognise that profit, it's a very different story. So again, I think practitioners need to be conscious that things will tighten in terms of cash. We saw it through the GFC here in Australia, and we're expected to see it again, that just economically it makes sense that cash will continue to tighten. So that means payment terms will blow out. And for those firms, and I've seen a number of them over the years, they might be super profitable, but it takes them a while to get paid. And again, I think it's really important that firms are very focused on that cash and very focused on how they get that cash in. I think, Terri, particularly some firms could make it easier for clients to pay their invoices. And what I mean by that is reducing the amount of friction. At Coleman Greig, we take money any way we can get it, basically. And it still surprises me that some firms make it difficult for their clients to pay them. So you want to ensure that you're able to accept credit card, and you're able to accept credit card at any time of day. More recently, we've always generally not accepted. We've always had Visa and MasterCard, but we've historically haven't had Amex. And in the last couple of months, we've just dropped on Amex and started charging our clients for the privilege, but that's something that in this day and age happens quite consistently. And even as a consumer, when you go to pay something via Amex or Visa or MasterCard, you expect to pay a merchant fee. So obviously you've got to check in terms of your jurisdiction that you operate in, how those fees and charges apply. But again, it's just making it seamless now, whether that's, as I've mentioned there before, credit cards, BPay, obviously advertising your bank account in terms of being able to allow clients to EFT in. So yeah, cash is really, really important at this point in time.
So what if your client's in a position where they want to pay but they're not going to be able to pay at all? What's your view on payment plans with your clients?
Yeah, again, it's really about understanding your client base, and that goes back to that earlier question. Mm-hmm. If you're dealing with a long-term client that you have known for a long time and dealt with for a long time, it's always a lot easier to make that judgment call, because it does become a judgment call whether you do support that client and do the work and know that you will get paid at a later stage. I think it's also really important that particularly if they're new clients and they've been upfront with you about that type of stuff, again, I'd understand, as I say to my guys, how did you get that referral in the first point? If they've come in off the street or they've come via the web, I tend to be a little bit cautious, but if they've been referred through from an accountant, for argument's sake, you've got a great opportunity to have a conversation with that accountant to say, hey, how are these guys positioned financially? Again, I think it's also important to look at constructive and potentially different ways of getting paid. So for those of you who operate in the personal services space, we've used a litigation funder for the last 3 or 4 years in family law, and those guys have worked really well. So again, it's particularly in the world of family law, we generally know that there's an asset pool, and that asset pool is going to get split a particular way. And so payment tends to be not always guaranteed, but 95% guaranteed. So working with those litigation funders and the clients to ensure that us as the law firm gets paid on a regular basis is super important. And again, I think the other thing is even some of those litigation funders also operate in sort of the accounting profession, and again, potentially may apply to commercial clients who may need some restructuring advice or need some particular advice. So again, I think it's, in this day and age, it's understanding who those providers are in the marketplace and exploring how they might assist you and your clients.
And I suppose some of the cash flow thing is going back to basics in a way, right? So making sure you're recording your time, monitoring your work in progress, and getting those bills out, which is always a thing, obviously for any business, but it's particularly so at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be a whole rigor around that, and there needs to be some formality around that. I think one of the key pieces of advice, if I can give to anyone listening into this, is don't leave this stuff too late. Get onto it now. And again, simple things like reviewing your time recording daily from your team to ensure that they are recording their time on a consistent and regular basis. And Terri, I said to you last week when you rang to talk through this presentation, I don't necessarily want to get into a debate around time recording or not time recording. Whatever or however you do it just needs to be done daily. I think also you need to work with those individuals in your practice who are not great at that, and now is a great time to do that. Change is really difficult, but when there's a bit of a crisis on, as I say, never lose the opportunity of the crisis to get some change through. And again, I think, we've, even in our own firm, have had that conversation over the last 2 weeks. And it was very pleasing for my financial controller to shoot me through an update this morning to say all bar one person had all their time recording up to date, and we've got our support teams and professionals recording time. So that's a fantastic outcome. But I think individuals recognise that, this is really important at this point in time. So again, allocate someone within the practice to be responsible for that. Now, whether that's you as the practitioner or the practice manager or whoever it happens to be, but I think, accounting for that stuff daily and following up those individuals who haven't submitted their time is really important. Have a think about doing your bills differently. Don't leave it to the end of the month. Bill as you go, or even if it is billing at alternate times during the month. I know some of our teams, particularly on larger jobs, they tend to bill twice a month because they don't want the clients to have any surprises. And again, along those lines, I think if you are engaging with your client and you're having that conversation with them, ensuring your fee estimates are up to date ensures that there are no surprises and again, managing your debtors on a daily basis as well, because again, I think that other key thing that sometimes doesn't happen in all firms is being able to do your bank reconciliation daily. Again, going back to that cash is king comment, doing those bank reconciliations daily gives you a clear picture of where your debtors are up to, and ensuring that you are, I suppose, quite firm in terms of managing your debtors and having sort of that pens down policy, because you don't want to continue to do work for those clients who, for whatever reason, aren't paying you. And again, I think that's a really important opportunity then to get on the blower in terms of understanding why they aren't paying you.
And how important is it? I mean, again, just staying with this idea of getting back to some basics, but how important is it right now to really be getting some money up front as well?
Yeah, look, I think if I go back to the GFC and some of the lessons that our firm learned out of that was because money tightens across the entire economy, it's not uncommon that all businesses start focusing in on cash, and all businesses start asking for funds up front. So again, I think it's also a good insight in terms of understanding the quality of the client, particularly if they're a newish client for you. And it always surprises me, particularly my guys in litigation. They go, Warrick, we had a new client come through and we asked for $50,000 up front. And what do you know, the next morning, there it is, $50,000 in trust. So again, I think sometimes it's difficult to gauge what a prospective client is going to be like, but getting those funds up front is usually a pretty good indicator of what they're going to be like to deal with. And again, I think the other interesting thing is if you can ensure that you've got money in trust on an ongoing basis, I think that's really important as well, because sometimes we get caught up in the matter and we kind of forget to ask for funds ongoing, and then it all becomes too hard to collect the cash. So again, that goes back to your earlier comment, Terri, about back to basics, just ensuring that those cash amounts remain in trust.
So let's turn, if we can, to what the broad spectrum of financial information is that you want to kind of be over the top of right now. And I'm sure that many on this call, if not most, are pretty familiar with their profit and loss and statements and their balance sheets. But if they're not, presumably this is not the time to start learning that, but it is the time to be talking to your financial advisor if you haven't had cause to look at those in any detail before. But I'm wondering, are there other things, there's other financial information apart from those perhaps most obvious ones that folks should in this environment be focusing on and getting on top of right now as well? And I know you've mentioned a couple of them, but I want to pick up particularly things around stimulus packages and stuff like that. What should you be doing with that information?
I suppose a couple of things in terms of back to basics. Again, again, I'm just looking at a dashboard that my financial controller finalised over the weekend for us. And so we're sort of getting down into the devil of the detail. So, we're not a mega firm, but 130 staff. So we're a reasonable operation these days. Getting down to things like understanding the number of new matters opened on a weekly basis, and understanding the value of those new matters opened. Again, we talk about lead and lag indicators. Those new matters particularly are a pretty good lead indicator in terms of how things are going. And again, putting some rigour around that, ensuring that the fee estimates are correct, and then they're updated accordingly as you move through. Again, back to the time recording, again, having a look at the average weekly WIP added. And again, what we've done is we've gone back to July 2019 to ensure that we sort of get a bit of a trend to understand what normality looks like. And again, understanding what WIP is being added goes back to my time recording piece. That really gives you an indicator of how busy people are. And combine that with the new matters really should give you a pretty good insight in terms of, particularly on a team basis, for those slightly larger firms, on how you're tracking. The other one that we do, which we've always done, we do a sort of a cash reconciliation daily, and that gets sent out to all principals, and that basically is looking at the month ahead. So we understand what our outgoings are for the month, so things like salaries and rent, etc., payroll tax, etc., and then have a clear picture on a day-by-day basis as we go through the month on where we're going to be positioned. That has our overdraft facility in it as well, and we've been quite blessed over the last 4 or 5 years where we haven't had to use the overdraft, because again, I kind of say using the overdraft is a bit of a lazy way to operate, because you can always go and collect more debtors and collect cash. And overdraft is really, in my mind, meant to be there for a rainy day, and potentially we might be having some of those rainy days ahead over the next couple of months. So, and I think the other key thing is managing your debtors and managing your debt collection. That's super important. Again, getting your bills out in a timely manner, and getting them out so clients can access them. So again, there's sort of some of the simple key metrics that we're using internally. In terms of some of the stimulus packages that are available, interestingly, obviously there's stuff coming at a federal level, but there's also stuff coming at a state jurisdiction level. And I'm certainly not an expert in terms of what's available across all states. But again, at a federal level, I think it's really important that practitioners understand what's available out there. I think for many practitioners, though, we won't be like a retail business where we've just seen an instant drop-off of our revenue. And again, the key figure there that the government's talking about, and hopefully that legislation will pass through Tuesday in the federal parliament, which is the 7th of April, is really about a reduction in 30% of revenue. And again, then you've got some ability to access funding in terms of their JobKeeper analysis. There's also some funding available in terms of interest-free loans and low-interest loans and all that goes with that. So again, I'd strongly encourage you to understand what that is, because again, if you're going to do some forecasting, you're going to do some cash flow analysis between now and 30 June, and then for next financial year, you need to be clear in terms of what availability of funds that you have. Now, for some practitioners and for some firms, that will probably hurt people's heads, and that goes back to, Terri, your earlier comment when you asked this question initially. Work with your accountant, and again, I would strongly encourage everyone to, if they haven't spoken to their accountant, pick up the phone and get in front of them ASAP, because they're probably getting smashed as well by all their commercial clients. And again, I think it's important that you regularly meet with them, even if it's via Zoom, to review where you're up to. I know for some smaller firms, they might only have a bookkeeper that comes in once a month. I'd strongly encourage them potentially to think a bit differently about that, and whether it is that they get them in once a week or once every 2 weeks, because again, information is key at this point in time, and you've got to have a clear picture financially on how you're tracking.
I wanted to pull out a couple of things there that you said, Warrick, that with the stimulus packages, I guess, to me, there's two things that are jumping out. One is that there are very specific eligibility criteria around these. So you've really got to see whether or not you match. And I guess the other thing is, which I'm sure folks are aware of here, we're by and large talking about deferred payments, not if you like, forgiving the payments in relation to a bunch of stuff. And I think that factors in particularly to what you were talking about in terms of looking at your 30 June situation, but also looking beyond that when you're doing your accounts for the next financial year, because you may be effectively moving quite a big amount of expense to the next financial year. Is that again a fair comment in terms of just underscoring a couple of the things that you've said there?
And again, yes, definitely. I think it's really important. I know many smaller practitioners probably aren't onto their accountants and financial accounts. They probably do them at the last minute, which means usually it's May the following year that they start looking at stuff like that. In this instance, I think it's really important that people, as I said earlier, have a clear picture. So I think, again, you need to work with your external accountants and get some of that year-end financial reporting done as quickly as possible, but also working with your external accountants, or for that matter, your bookkeeper or your practice manager or whoever it happens to be, to do some cash flow modelling and budgeting for next financial year. Again, if you've got a practice it's going to travel along reasonably okay, again, I think it's important that you've still got a clear picture of where the opportunities lie. And, again, interestingly, even in our own practice, we were sort of looking at if we've got any CapEx, obviously what we don't continue on with in a CapEx space, but also potentially what we might have already committed to, and do we bring some of that CapEx forward so we get the complete 100% deduction if it meets the certain criteria pre-30 June, or what do we do in terms of looking at stuff that we can't do this financial year from a CapEx point of view, but next financial year, and can we get the 50% discount? So there's also some tax planning in all of that as well. So again, encourage listeners to again speak to their external accountant, because again, for those of us who particularly may not have got tax planning done in this sort of last quarter of the year, I think now more than ever it's really important to understand where you're sitting and where the opportunities lie. Because again, with every crisis there's also opportunities. So again, as I said, if you're a firm that's tracking along reasonably well, it's important that you understand where those opportunities are, but you need to get onto that pre-30 June.
Yeah, and as you say, that timing aspect, absolutely critical. I wanted to jump on expenses for a second and just drill down a little bit more into those. I mean, I guess at the moment, everyone's going through every single expense item and basically looking at every single outgoing and focusing with a very fine-tooth comb on those. But taking a couple of, what are the big expense items for everybody, premises or rent and people and salaries, what are some thoughts or some tips in relation to each of those, and maybe starting with the premises/rent expense item?
Again, I think, look, in terms of the rent space, Terri, for many of us, particularly those of us who are now working from home, got space everywhere in Sydney. We've got 5 offices, and interestingly, some landlords have been on the front foot already. One of our landlords, God bless them, has provided us a 50% discount for the month of April. But then from our other landlords, we've heard boo. So again, part of the process is once we understand where the government lies, and our firm's based in New South Wales, where it sits in terms of commercial tenancies, that again is still being nutted through. It's then working with our landlords and having a formal discussion with them to see if we can negotiate. And again, I think, even if you can save 20%, that's, as I say, better than a poke in the eye. So again, it's really about having those conversations with your landlord and not being afraid to have those conversations.
Is it also Warrick looking forward now as well? Because we're talking about like to the 30th of June, but if you're kind of in a situation where you've got your lease kind of on the table to be renegotiated and looking at all the things that you were just talking about, but also is it worth thinking about at this point in time, if people are working from home and they're comfortable working from home and it's worked, should we actually seriously be looking at how much space we're going to need in the future to the extent that we can negotiate that?
Yeah, I was speaking to a managing partner last week, and the conversation went that they were looking at replicating a fit out that they'd done in another state. Interestingly, she made the comment that they'd pulled the pin on looking for space because they actually need to take a step back and assess the environment that potentially they will need moving forward, because it will be different. Now, interestingly, we're moving into some new space in Parramatta, and part of the excitement around the office before we went to working from home was the savvier people in the office kind of went, where a lot of our hard work is going to be done because we're moving into an agile environment in January next year, assuming all on track. And I think the way in which we work will be different, Terri. And ultimately, interestingly, speaking to my property guys and my property team, they go, Warrick, in terms of those commercial landlords are probably shaking in their boots because, in terms of firms looking at things differently and understanding, do they actually need all this space? And again, to be fair, it's still fairly early days. It's week 2, it's week 3 of working from home. But I think for those firms that have sort of bit the bullet and been able to relatively easily transition from an office environment to working from home, those firms particularly will look at things and go, actually, we can do it different. So again, I think it's important that if you're in a current lease at the moment, which has an expiry date in the short term, or for that matter, you might be on a month-to-month type arrangement, again, having a think about potentially what your needs are when we do get out of this. And more importantly, again, depending on what type of space, if you are on a month-to-month lease, the ability to negotiate with your landlord currently, I think would be pretty positive. Terri, the other thing which I'd encourage, again, if you're in that space negotiation piece, and we've used one for the last 10 years, engage with the tenant advocate. They can act on your behalf. They understand what's happening in the market. They're savvy, and they're acting with your interests in mind. Again, I've got some great property lawyers in my team, and they're great at commercial property, but they negotiate the legalities of commercial lease. Being able to negotiate a commercial lease and understanding what's going on out there in the market, particularly in the current climate, is really important. So I'd strongly encourage people to have a think about a tenant advocate.
Warrick, we're going to have a whole kind of podcast on and a webinar on looking at employment issues. So the question I'm about to ask you, I'm asking you purely from a financial point of view and not with any other aspect attached to it. But just on the peoples and salaries part, and again, thinking of it in terms of an expense in a business situation, what are your thoughts about, for example, getting people to take leave if that's possible, or How are you folks kind of managing or handling that?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important to understand what your provisions are and understand what opportunities there are for people to take leave. Again, it really then also gets back to understanding where you are positioning the firm in terms of do you want to retain the vast majority of your staff over the next 6 months, or do you want to let staff go? I know certainly, Terri, there's been some media in the last couple of days, both in industry press and the AFR, around what some of the larger firms are doing.
Yeah.
Again, I think collectively you need to have a clear strategy around that and ensure that that's communicated to your troops. Again, for us, we had a hook up via Zoom on Friday, staff town hall meeting, and, I strongly encouraged everyone, because it's quite interesting. Easter's always a time where people do take a lot of leave, and we had a number of people who had come in and cancelled that leave. And we actually went back to everybody and said, actually, guys, if you submitted to take leave, I know leave won't be exciting this year, but you'll get all those odd jobs done around the house. Please take your leave as requested. So again, I think it's really about understanding who has significant long service leave, because law tends to attract a lot of people who stay on for a long time in firms, which is great. To understand where you could take that long service leave, and obviously who's got some chunky annual leave. Again, I think it's important, though, that you look at that from a cash flow point of view, because, again, you've still got to fund that leave. But it's important, I know, to ensure that you've got those provisions managed. So, again, whoever looks after your payroll, ask them to produce a report so you've got a clear picture on who's got leave and who's got the opportunity to take leave. And if that leave, in terms of accrual, marries up in terms of some areas of law which may drop off, there's a great opportunity to tell people to take some leave over the next 6 months.
And it's really important, isn't it, to do the numbers on all of those staffing scenarios. So to really know, in the absolute worst case scenario, is it really financially the most viable? And again, I'm looking at this only from a business point of view. There's a huge human element to this that we'll be addressing in other places, but does it really make the most sense to be retrenching people versus retraining them? Obviously, recruitment's going to be, I imagine, pretty much on the back foot at the moment, redeploying people, whatever the case may be, but making those decisions, as you say, very much with the data in front of you.
And again, I think the other thing is, I don't believe I haven't said this already, but yeah, going back to my earlier comment about strategy around staff, whatever you do, go hard and go early in relation to staff. I think that's the key thing. As I said, some of those firms that were in the press over the last week or so, they've obviously been very clear in terms of some of the strategies that they wanted to implement. But again, I think it's really important that you have a clear picture of where you are positioned financially. I was speaking to a contact earlier this morning, and they were involved with a firm in Melbourne who wanted to do a bit of a knee-jerk reaction and go, right, everyone's got to work 4 days a week type scenario. That was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction because they actually didn't really understand what was happening, even from the viewpoint of understanding what was happening in the courts, because they were heavily based litigation practice. So again, I think it's really, really important that you've got a clear picture of everything financially, how the court, if you operate in that space in terms of the courts. Here in New South Wales, the amount of change that I've seen in the court system in the last 3 weeks, it's been mind-blowing in a really positive way, because a lot of those government departments, justice, etc., have really had to fast-track some stuff that was probably sitting in someone's top drawer in terms of being able to operate in a way that's electronic and in a way that still means the wheels of justice tick over. So again, in terms of from that staffing point of view, I wouldn't make a clear call until you've got a clear picture of where your risks lie and where you're sitting financially.
And interestingly, I think this is the first time that I can recall where we've seen such open and disclosed discussions about also looking at salary cuts. So, for example, partners deciding that they will take a salary cut in a firm we haven't necessarily seen that in quite the same way before. So I guess that's another alternative, but a somewhat newer development, I guess, in these conversations about staffing as well.
And I think, Terri, that's purely because we're all going through this. It's not that this is an economic downturn that's sort of gradually crept up on us, and some firms are going to do well and some firms aren't going to do well, vis-a-vis GFC. Everybody is in the same boat. Everybody, is where they can, working from home. And again, I think, that how you treat your staff and how you engage with your staff will long be remembered after this economic and health crisis moves on. So I think, that's also something that you need to be considerate of strategically. How you manage your team is potentially going to pay you back in spades over time.
Absolutely. I wanted to finish up the discussion on expenses and then come back to income a little bit. I know we spent quite a lot of time on cash flow, which is critically important. But I guess there are some items in expenses that people can overlook, but they kind of creep up and grab them, things like, maintenance agreements, around cost for software. What are a couple of others in that ilk that people should just make sure that they've got their vision or on their radar screen about?
Again, Terri, I think, things like subscription costs move, even from a cash point of view. If you don't want to reduce anything or you can't reduce anything, move to monthly payments. Go and have a chat to your vendor. And again, I know historically some firms I've worked for, it's some of the easiest wins you go in because they've always paid these expenses upfront annually for the year.
Yeah.
And in a climate where cash is tight, it's really important that you manage that as best as you can. So again, look at that on a monthly basis. Things like your library subscription. Our team is looking at that at the moment. And again, I think it's important that you understand where you're getting value in this day and age where most library subscriptions are online. And let's be honest, if they're not online moving forward, well, they're going to be not much use to most of us. Have a look at what usage rates you're getting and have a chat to your research house in terms of getting them to give you some insight in terms of usage, because again, I think for many firms that becomes a really interesting conversation. Basics like in terms of office that would normally get delivered, the newspaper, the milk, the fruit, all that kind of stuff. Again, I was speaking to another colleague down in Melbourne last week, and she said, "Warrick, we used to get milk delivered to the office. There's only a handful of us in the office. We just go and get a 2-litre of milk down the shop downstairs every day." Again, it's just thinking about doing it differently. The Law Society here in New South Wales, Terri, has been fantastic. They came out last week and announced, because it's subscription time for membership dues for the Law Society, and they've dropped their subs from $410 to $10 per lawyer. And that's a pretty significant saving, and also I think something that the Law Society recognised in the current climate. It's pretty serious to manage that. So, and the other one that I had there was moving forward, if you've got CLEs to do, I think again there's a great opportunity to look differently at how you do those CLEs. This is a perfect example. If you're listening into this one, this is all contributes towards your CLE points, and again something that the college is putting on free of charge. So again, I think there's a great opportunity to do things smarter, not necessarily harder in the current times.
I suppose it's even looking at things like, maybe it's even looking at your Zoom licenses and seeing how many do you have, how many do you need? And I know that's going to apply to a lot of different things, right?
And again, I think it's taking that to the next level for those of us that are operating Office 365. There's some really good functionality in that package that I bet you most firms aren't using. So for argument's sake, if you didn't want to spend the coin on Zoom, spend it on Teams, which is part of the Office 365 package.
Yeah.
Comes free if you're part of your subscription. And interestingly, Microsoft are now scrambling to, I suppose, provide similar functionality to Zoom.
Yeah.
And again, I think if you have a look at what's available out there in your Office 365 pack subscription, there's a great opportunity to leverage more of what you've already got.
And certainly a lot of free communication apps. And I guess the biggest thing around that is obviously going to be security, but certainly a lot of options there. Let me flip, if I may, to income, the income side again for a second. And as I say, we've talked about cash flow, and we've talked about keeping an eye on expenditure. You mentioned, and I just wanted to pick up something that you said earlier, I think being vigilant about transferring funds from your trust account to your general account. And I think that's worth just underscoring, because it can sit there for a while sometimes, can't it?
Yeah, and look, again, I always find it interesting in terms of chatting to colleagues, and I suppose this is just a really simple, easy win. For many practice management software systems, you can actually allocate when funds come into trust and when they can be transferred, so it produces an automatic report. Back in the bad old days, I know we used to wait for our trial balance to come out, and then the lawyer would, tick off to go, transfer from trust to office. Again, in New South Wales, and I'm not sure in other jurisdictions, monies have got to, once you've issued a bill, monies have got to sit in trust for 7 days after that bill's been issued, then you can transfer across. We do that now. We transfer out of trust daily. And again, it's just some of those simple ways of being able to reduce your lockup. And again, it's your money. You've got it there to access. It's just doing it in a timely and efficient manner.
Yep. So recheck your regs and make sure that, again, you're focusing on that cash flow aspect again. I'm going to invite folks, if you've got any questions that you'd like to pose at this point, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And while you're doing that and thinking about that, Warrick, I wanted to just ask you, as folks are listening to all of this today, and I know that you've seen a lot of these, so you'll have some good thoughts. What are your top kind of common mistakes that people are likely to make at times like this?
I suppose not being on top of where they should be. And as I said there earlier, you need to have a clear picture from early on how you're sitting financially. And again, if that means that you've got to spend some money and engage with your external accountant, I'd strongly encourage you to do that. Again, for many businesses, sometimes help comes too late. And that if people were on the front foot and gave it the priority that they should give, particularly in the current climate, that's really important. I think the other thing in terms of cash, Terri, is, and we've already mentioned them throughout this session, but there's some really simple, easy wins that you can implement to get cash flow ticking along better, whether that's stuff like the trust to office transfers, whether that's reducing the amount of friction that it takes for you to receive a payment. Again, it still surprises me that sometimes dealing with professional service organisations, if you want to pay them at 9 o'clock at night, you can't. And I think in this current crisis, that's probably something that's unacceptable, where cash is king. So again, make it easy for clients to pay you. And again, I think understanding the amount of change that's happened within the profession, both at a state jurisdictional level and also at a federal jurisdictional level, is quite dramatic. And again, I think until you have a clear picture of how that's going to impact positively or negatively on your practice, I think it's really important that that practitioners are across that, and particularly getting updates in terms of practice notes, etc., to understand where all that's heading, because it's mind-blowing in a really positive way. And I think the change that's going to occur both for the profession and the jurisdictional bodies that manage us, in terms of the courts, etc., is going to be something that I think for many of us we thought we'd never see.
And Warrick, what are you folks doing, like in terms, again, looking at this purely from a financial point of view, what sort of resources are you using or turning to help yourself keep up to date and on top of all of this stuff? Because I imagine, your firm is looking to you to provide that info. Where are you going to try to find it?
Look, for us, Terri, I suppose we're quite lucky. We've actually got a COVID blog that we're developing, and again, because we've got a significant client base that is commercial, but interestingly, from the change that's happening at a jurisdictional level, again, just being on top of what's happening in the media, number one. Number two, we've got a couple of staff members who sit on Law Society working committees. And again, some of the information that we're getting out of that particular group is really important. We're actually capturing across the firm what people are doing. So for argument's sake, the week before last, we were involved at a federal jurisdiction level in the family court, being one of the first firms being involved in a video conference hookup in relation to consent orders. Now, we kind of shared that amongst the firm to say, hey, this is how it worked, and obviously the Chief Justice has come out, he's on radio again today on Radio National, talking about what the federal court judges are doing in terms of family and Microsoft Teams, etc. So again, I think it's really important that you understand where that information can be sourced from. Generally, the law societies are pretty good in terms of updating that information as well. So again, there's a couple of channels there where you can get that information quite clearly. But again, I think it's really a time of sharing. So again, part of how we capture that information across the firm is there's another Office 365 product called Yammer, and we've got a specific COVID stream on that Yammer channel. And again, it's about capturing all that relevant information where people can go to as one source of truth.
Fantastic. Warrick, thank you so much for your time today. Really, really appreciated it. We've covered a lot of territory in a very short period of time and hopefully provided some helpful, very practical tips for folks. I can't wait for the session tomorrow. And again, folks, don't forget there is that session tomorrow looking at the planning aspects as you're particularly focusing on the next few months and the many months that will follow thereafter. You'll find information about that and all of the podcasts and webinars in this Reinvent Legal Business series on the Centre for Legal Innovations website. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you very much, everyone, also on the call today for coming along. It's been a pleasure to see you. And again, Warrick, our thanks to you particularly. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, Terri. Thanks for having me.